Clarence Boon entered the Harrison County Courthouse with an air of quiet determination. The early morning light filtered through the large windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The hum of activity around him, the clicks of heels on tile, the soft murmur of conversations all seemed to fall away as he moved through the space. He wasn't in a hurry. His steps were measured, deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of years of unseen battles, fought both in foreign lands and on forgotten fronts at home. His coat, though clean, was faded a deep blue that had seen the sun and the passage of many seasons. The collar was turned up slightly against the chill in the air, and his shoes, though polished, were not new. They were well-worn, shaped by miles of hard walking. His hands were steady as he gripped a crumpled appointment card, and in the other he carried a worn canvas bag, the strap resting comfortably across his shoulder. There was no swagger in his stride, no sense of entitlement. He was simply there, waiting in line with the same quiet patience he had carried with him through every phase of his life. The young woman at the front counter didn't look up right away. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, chewing gum idly, as she typed the kind of gum that could be popped and snapped at will. She wore the badge, Sims, but the name on her chest wasn't the one that mattered to Clarence. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He was here because he had a purpose, a quiet duty to fulfill. When she finally glanced up, it was with a look that took in his coat, his hands, and finally his skin. There was no immediate warmth in her eyes, no recognition. Clarence was just another person to get through on her busy day. "You got ID?" she asked, not unkindly, but not kindly either. It was the kind of question that demanded the right answer, not because it mattered, but because the process required it. Clarence nodded, reaching into his coat pocket with the same slow, deliberate movements. He pulled out his military ID, the edges a little worn from years of use, and placed it on the counter with a soft tap. It was a simple gesture, but one that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. He had been here before in other rooms, other moments of service. His quiet dignity was a constant companion. Sims paused as she picked up the ID, her eyes scanning it briefly before meeting Clarence's again. "You're a witness," she asked, her tone flat, as if she was trying to reconcile the man before her with the words she had just read. Clarence nodded. "I was asked to testify. I have documents for the case. They need to go to the clerk for Judge Petrov's docket." His voice was steady, calm, almost too calm, as though he had rehearsed these words 1,000 times, each one familiar yet weighty. She didn't take the folder from him immediately. Instead, she gave him a flat look, almost dismissive, before calling over her shoulder. "Rick, can you come here?" Her voice was louder now, the tone that of someone who believed her request was reasonable, necessary. And then Clarence felt the presence of Officer Rick Holston approaching before he saw the man himself. Holston was young, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut and an air of confidence that seemed to speak louder than any words. He carried himself like someone whose uniform answered all questions before they were asked. His gaze swept over Clarence, measuring him in a single glance. He didn't see a veteran. He didn't see a man who had sacrificed everything. He saw a problem to be solved, a man who didn't fit his assumptions. "This man's trying to hand over documents," Sims said, voice tinged with impatience. Holston raised an eyebrow, folding his arms across his chest. "You have a scheduled testimony?" he asked, eyeing Clarence like he was a puzzle that didn't quite fit. "It's on the docket, 10:30. Eli May's case?" Clarence answered, his voice calm, unshaken. Holston smirked, a smug tilt to his lips. "You came alone?" he asked, almost mocking. "No lawyer? I'm a witness." Clarence replied, simply, his expression unwavering. "I was asked to bring these." There was a long pause before Holston leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret with Clarence that only he needed to hear. "You sure you're in the right building, sir?" The question dripped with condescension. "This isn't the social services line." Clarence didn't flinch. His gaze remained level, unbroken. "I know where I am." He said, his words firm but gentle. Holston stepped closer, his posture shifting. "You'll need to wait over there. We'll call someone to verify your claim." His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Clarence, still holding the folder tightly, didn't take a step back. "I've waited 2 weeks for this hearing. These are original documents, certified. I was told to hand them to the court myself." The officer's jaw tensed as he leaned closer. "I'm telling you to wait." And in that moment, something changed. Clarence didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He stood his ground, unwavering, silent. The tension in the air shifted as though the room itself recognized the weight of the moment. "I followed every rule since I walked in," Clarence said quietly. "I only asked to be treated the same." There was no response. Holston's eyes flickered with something annoyance, perhaps, or uncertainty, but he didn't speak. He simply stood there, arms folded, his gaze sharp and challenging. And then from behind them, a voice broke the silence. It was soft, uncertain, but clear. "Why are they being mean to him, Mom?" The voice of a child. A boy no older than 7 or 8 tugged at his mother's sleeve. His innocent question hung in the air unanswered, but it seemed to pierce the tension that had settled like a heavy fog in the room. Clarence didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge the question, but the boy's words seemed to spark a shift in the atmosphere. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world had paused. Time hung still, waiting for someone to do the right thing. But no one did. Instead, Officer Holston took a step forward and shoved Clarence with a firm hand to the shoulder. It was a forceful, casual movement, one he had done before, and one that carried the weight of authority he believed he held. Clarence stumbled backward, his heel catching on the welcome mat. The folder slipped from his grasp, papers scattering across the floor like startled birds. Clarence fell to the ground, the impact a dull, heavy thud that reverberated through the quiet courthouse. His breath came in shallow gasps as he instinctively reached for the floor, his right hand landing wrong, a sharp crack echoing in the space. For a moment there was silence, deep, suffocating silence. The sound of Clarence's fall seemed to hang in the air, lingering as if time itself had momentarily forgotten how to move. The clerk froze mid-type. The man on his phone lowered it slowly, and an elderly couple glanced over only to look away just as quickly, as if pretending they hadn't seen what had just happened. No one moved to help him. Clarence remained on the floor, blinking slowly, his breath shallow but steady. Blood began to smear the base of his palm, a dark crimson stain marking where his hand had met the cold marble floor. The room stood frozen in place, no one daring to speak, no one daring to act. And then, with deliberate care, Clarence began to gather the papers one by one. His hands trembled slightly, but his movements were controlled. There was no moaning, no theatrics, just quiet dignity as he began to collect what had been scattered. The only sound was the soft rustle of paper and the occasional shuffle of a bystander stepping away without offering help. He was still there, kneeling in the silence, gathering the pieces of a story that had been scattered, forgotten. And in that moment, something shifted. Something in the room and the air began to change. The quiet defiance of Clarence Boon became something more than just a witness. He became a symbol. As the weight of that silence pressed down the room, could not escape the quiet truth: Clarence had never asked for attention, for applause, for recognition. He had simply stood unwavering in the face of everything that had tried to push him down. And now, finally, the world had begun to listen. Clarence Boon's back ached as he carefully rose to his feet, each movement slow but deliberate, like someone who had long ago learned how to bear the weight of more than just his own body. The pages now gathered in his arms were still slipping from his trembling fingers, but he didn't let them go. Not this time. He bent down again, his breath tight, but he never let his composure break. The courthouse was still silent, the air thick with unspoken questions. Officer Holston, still standing rigid, didn't make a move to help. His eyes, however, were watching Clarence now closer than before, perhaps because he hadn't expected the man to rise at all. But Clarence didn't flinch. He didn't allow himself to feel the weight of the room's indifference. There were no sympathetic looks, no outstretched hands, just the stillness that felt like the space between thunderclaps. It was the calm before the storm. The few onlookers, the ones who had seen Clarence fall, continued to stay in their place, frozen passive, as if an invisible wall had been erected between them and the man on the floor. The elderly couple across the room glanced away, avoiding eye contact like it might break the silence that had settled around Clarence. The only movement now was from the boy who had asked the question earlier. "Why are they being mean to him, Mom?" His voice, soft and filled with confusion, had been swallowed by the room's tension. His mother had tugged him closer, but the boy didn't stop staring at Clarence. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: the man hadn't done anything wrong. Clarence finally stood tall, still holding the folder close to his chest, his hands slightly trembling from the strain, but never breaking his composed posture. He wiped a streak of blood from the corner of his lip with the back of his hand, a thin trail of red now marking his knuckles. The pain was sharp, but it was a pain he had long ago learned to ignore. The ache in his shoulder, the sting in his palm, the bruise forming on his back, all were old companions. He glanced up, and for the briefest moment his eyes met the officer's. Holston stood a few feet away, arms crossed, tightly, eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty beneath his hard exterior. He didn't move. He just watched as if waiting for Clarence to give him a reason to react. The moment stretched out. It wasn't loud. There were no raised voices. No one shouted. But in that silence, Clarence felt something much louder than any argument, any accusation. His voice, though still and quiet, seemed to pierce through the stillness. His words, though simple, were full of something far stronger than anger. They carried the weight of a man who had lived through hardship, through loss, and had long since learned how to carry on. "You can knock me down, Officer Clarence," said his voice calm but firm, "but that won't keep me from standing." The words hung in the air, like the faintest echo, a simple statement that felt like a truth that had been hidden for too long. The room, which had been so quiet before now, felt even quieter, as though everyone inside had collectively stopped breathing, waiting for the meaning of his words to settle in. The clerk behind the desk froze. Her fingers hovered above her keyboard, uncertain whether she should continue typing, uncertain of what she had just witnessed. The man on his phone, now staring at Clarence, slowly lowered it, his face blank, as if the image on the screen no longer mattered. The elderly couple, the ones who had quickly looked away earlier, were now looking at Clarence again, their faces softened, though still filled with the same quiet reluctance to fully engage. Officer Holston remained still. His jaw was clenched, his arms still folded across his chest, but there was something else now, something that shifted in his stance. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a concession of any kind. It was just a moment that Clarence had made possible simply by standing. And then, as if on cue, a voice broke the silence. It was the boy again, though this time his voice was softer, almost tentative. Why did that man hurt him? The question, simple and pure, cut through the tension, exposing the coldness of the moment. He wasn't doing anything. The words hung in the air, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. No one responded to the child. No one had an answer. But it was clear that the child had seen what others hadn't, or perhaps what others had refused to see. Clarence didn't answer the child. He didn't need to. His silence, his stillness spoke volumes. His presence, steady, unwavering, and calm, was enough. His quiet dignity had become louder than any words. And as he stood there gathering the pieces of his scattered documents, it felt like the weight of the room was shifting ever so slightly, though no one dared acknowledge it. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the final page, but his movements were measured, controlled. It was as if he had done this 100 times before, not just gathering papers, but gathering the pieces of his own life that had been scattered in the wind of neglect and indifference. He straightened his coat, dusting off the edges, as if the fabric could be shaken clean of the years it had carried with it. The blood on his hands stained the sleeve of his coat, but it didn't seem to matter. He didn't look at Officer Holston. He didn't look at the clerk. He didn't look at anyone. His gaze was fixed forward beyond the courtroom, beyond the stares of the onlookers, as though he could see something no one else could. The door to the courtroom loomed ahead, and without asking for permission, without waiting for clearance, Clarence Boon walked forward. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence, but this time no one tried to stop him. No one blocked his path. It wasn't permission that he needed, it was presence, and he had that in abundance. Clarence Boon's steps echoed through the hallway as he approached the doors of courtroom 3B. Each footfall was deliberate, a slow metronome marking the passage of time. His fingers brushed the cool metal handle of the door, and for a brief moment the weight of everything he had endured settled into his chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. The room behind him still hummed with a quiet, unsettled energy, but it felt like the door was a barrier that separated him from it, a space where the truth could finally be spoken. Inside the courtroom, a soft murmur rose as Clarence walked in. His presence, once dismissed, now commanded attention. No one stopped him this time. There was no officer, no barrier. He walked toward the front row, his gait slow, but unwavering, his military posture still intact. His eyes never wavered, never faltered. He wasn't looking for acknowledgement. He wasn't seeking applause. He was simply there as he had been before, stoic, composed, determined. He reached the table reserved for exhibits, the wooden surface worn and familiar. With deliberate care, he placed the folder on the table. The thud it made was soft, but it carried with it the weight of years of service, of sacrifice, of a life that had been overlooked and misunderstood. The courtroom fell silent, the hushed whispers of attorneys and clerks pausing as Clarence opened the folder. The documents inside were meticulously preserved, their edges slightly yellowed with age, the plastic sleeves crinkling faintly as he turned the pages. Each sheet was a testament to his history, a history he had never asked to be recognized, but one that had shaped him in ways no one else had cared to notice. The first page he revealed was a photograph. It showed 5 men all dressed in military fatigues, squinting into the harsh desert light. One of the men barely in focus was Clarence, young, leaner, but unmistakable. His arm was draped around another soldier, his expression tired but resolute. Beneath the photo was a caption, Boon Clarence E. Lieutenant, ASOC Operation Dust Lantern, April 2004, Mosul Sector Delta. The photo was more than just an image. It was a record, a story, one that had been written in the dust of foreign lands, in the dirt and blood of battle. The murmurs in the room grew quieter as the opposing counsel leaned forward, eyes fixed on the image. They didn't know Clarence. They didn't understand who he was. But in that moment, they began to see him, if only for a second. Clarence didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply continued to turn the pages one by one, revealing medical clearance papers, blood transfusion logs, and evacuation reports. Then came the after-action report written in thick blue ink, stamped with the word confidential. The words were clear, precise. Boone extracted 3 wounded airmen under hostile fire during Operation Dust Lantern, refused airlift until the last injured was secured. Sustained shrapnel wounds to shoulder and rib. Continued to command until final evac. Silver Star citation to be submitted. It was more than just a record. It was history, raw and unvarnished, the kind of history no one had cared to ask about. No one had bothered to remember. The room was still, save for the soft rustling of paper. The attorneys, the clerk, even the bailiff all leaned in now, their gazes fixed on the documents. There was a growing sense of recognition, a dawning awareness that Clarence was not just any man. He was a soldier, a survivor, a man who had carried more than his fair share of burdens. And now, finally, the truth was being laid bare for all to see. Lena Foster, who had been standing quietly at the rear of the courtroom, felt the shift in the air. She had recorded the events earlier, capturing Clarence's quiet defiance. But now, as she watched him stand in front of the exhibit table, the full weight of what he had endured became clear. It wasn't just a case. It wasn't just a witness. It was something deeper, something more profound. Her phone, which had once been an instrument of passive observation, now felt like an artifact, something that had captured history in real time. She was no longer recording an event. She was witnessing it. Clarence continued to stand there unmoving as the room began to recognize what had been hidden from them for so long. His actions, his silence, his service, everything he had given was now in full view, undeniable and inescapable. And then from the back of the room a voice rose. It was Eli Mays, the man whose case had brought Clarence here. His voice was raw, thick with emotion, but steady. "That file," Eli said, his words carrying the weight of his own struggle. "It's why I walk with wheels and not with nothing." He paused, his eyes never leaving Clarence. "You got me out alive, but I never knew you kept the proof." Clarence's eyes softened, but his expression remained unchanged. He didn't speak right away. His silence was more eloquent than any words he could have said. Finally, he replied, his voice low and steady. "You didn't need it. I did." The words landed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Eli's eyes filled with understanding, but there was more than just recognition in his gaze. There was respect for the man who had saved his life, and never once sought acknowledgement, never once sought recognition for the sacrifices he had made. The room seemed to hold its breath as more voices began to rise one after another. A man in the back stood up, his hands shaking as he spoke. "He pulled my son out of a Humvee fire." The room turned toward him, and his words echoed through the silence. Another voice joined in, a woman in uniform, a current officer speaking of Clarence's bravery under fire. One by one, people began to share their stories, recounting moments when Clarence had saved their lives, when he had risked everything without ever asking for anything in return. Lena's camera remained steady in her hands, but her eyes were now wide, not with the anticipation of capturing something for social media, but with the awe of witnessing something she had never expected. She understood now what Clarence had done. He hadn't just saved lives in the field, he had carried those lives, carried them through everything, and now in this courtroom, he was carrying the truth. The room had shifted. What had begun as a simple court case, a legal proceeding, had now become a reckoning. The silence that had once been oppressive had given way to something else, a kind of reverence, a recognition of the truth that had always been there, but had never been seen. And all the while, Clarence Boon remained still standing in the center of it all, holding the folder like a soldier guards a fallen comrade. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for anything. He simply stood the quiet witness to a history no one had bothered to remember. Clarence Boon returned to his routine as if nothing had changed. The small apartment on the corner of 4th and Pine still held the same quiet, familiar rhythms. The thick curtains remained drawn, casting the rooms in a muted light, and the small kitchen smelled of stale coffee that hadn't yet been brewed for the day. It was all so ordinary, and yet it felt entirely different now. He woke at 7:45 every morning, just as he always had. He pulled on his worn shoes, smoothed the creases of his coat, and stepped out of his apartment to catch the bus. Nothing about his steps changed, not the careful way he adjusted his coat, nor the slight lift of his head as he passed the street vendors setting up on the sidewalk. His life had always been about the quiet consistency of routine, the unremarkable moments that when strung together formed a life worth living. And yet, despite the unchanged motions, the world felt different now. Clarence had not asked for this. He had not asked for the world to stop, for voices to rise in his defense. The footage from Lena's phone had gone viral overnight. People had seen it. People had heard it. They had seen him fall, seen him stand, and in that simple act, something in the world had shifted. But Clarence was still the same man who had lived quietly, who had carried his burdens silently, and never expected applause. The calls came, of course. There were the reporters who wanted an interview, the officials who wanted to shake his hand, the veterans who wanted to thank him. But Clarence didn't respond to any of it. He simply continued on one foot in front of the other, just as he always had. When Lena showed up at his door that evening, he didn't seem surprised. She had been waiting outside, her breath visible in the cool air, as if she had known he would be home. She didn't knock. She just waited until he opened the door, as if she understood something about him, something no one else had yet seen. "I thought you might want to know," she said, her voice careful, hesitant, almost as though unsure if he would care. "The country's listening." Clarence raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He wasn't sure what she meant by listening. He wasn't interested in headlines or social media praise. He had lived through too much to care about what strangers thought of him. But there was something in Lena's voice, something in the way she looked at him that made him pause. "They're quoting you," she added. "The line about how you spoke and the way you got up. It's everywhere." Clarence didn't smile. He simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, but nothing more. "That line," he said softly, "wasn't for them. It was for the boy." Lena frowned, not understanding at first. The boy. The child who had asked why they were being mean to Clarence. It had been a simple question, but it had carried the weight of a truth that no one had dared to speak. Clarence hadn't wanted his silence to become something that grew old. He hadn't wanted that child to think that standing up for what was right meant being crushed by the weight of the world. Clarence looked out the window, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the streets of Harrison County, something that none of the cameras or the viral hashtags could capture. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't someone to be lauded. He was just a man who had been asked to testify, who had been knocked down, and who had stood up. And that was enough for him. Outside on the street, someone was spray painting a mailbox. The words were simple, almost understated. "Justice doesn't need applause. It needs memory." Clarence saw it for a moment before Lena closed the door behind her and followed him inside. The video had gone viral. It had reached millions. By the morning, it had over 500,000 views. By noon, it had surpassed 1 million. People weren't just watching it, they were talking about it. They were commenting, sharing their stories, and most of all, they were remembering. The hashtag started to emerge, She Stand with Boon. Never forgotten. In small towns and crowded cities across the country, people were standing up. Veterans, nurses, teachers, even college students all gathered outside courthouses, not shouting, not rioting, but standing in quiet solidarity. Posters were made carrying the simple words, "Stand with Boone." There were no speeches, no applause, just people standing together, honoring something that had never asked for honor. Clarence didn't watch the news. He didn't look at the social media posts. He wasn't interested in any of it, but he knew what was happening. He could feel it in the air, in the way people's gazes lingered on him as he passed by, in the way strangers offered him a nod of respect, as if they understood something about him that he hadn't spoken aloud. It was an unspoken recognition, a shift in the way the world saw him. And it was enough. Clarence didn't attend any ceremonies. He didn't seek out interviews. He didn't seek recognition. But the recognition found him quietly, steadily, like the slow ripple of a stone dropped into still water. It didn't matter to him. What mattered was that people were listening. Lena, who had never expected anything to come from recording that moment, had printed a small book, a personal account of what had happened that day, a record of the testimony in silence. She didn't want it published in the traditional sense. She didn't want to profit from it. She simply wanted 12 copies, one for each community library in the district, one for a federal archive, and one for Clarence. She mailed it to him without expecting a response. But a week later, she found her copy back on her porch. There was no note attached, just the book returned to her. Inside, between pages 47 and 48, there was a small piece of paper with a message handwritten in a familiar hand: "You listened. That's enough." CB, the book wasn't widely known. It wasn't promoted. It wasn't on bestseller lists or in the library's most borrowed section, but it didn't matter. Because in that small town, in those quiet moments, people found it. A young boy searching for books about planes stopped when he saw the word testimony on the spine. He pulled it out and sat cross-legged, reading slowly, a little straighter, with each page he turned. An older woman, a retired nurse, and the widow of a veteran found the book while looking for memoirs. She stood by the library window, turning each page with reverence as though reading something sacred. By the time she reached the last line, she pressed her hand over it, closing her eyes in quiet reflection. And Clarence. He simply kept living. He still walked to the bus stop every morning, still ordered the same black coffee at the diner on 9th Street. He still sat in the park by the Bronze War Memorial, reading the newspaper as children biked past. He never asked about the book. He never spoke about the video or the people who had stood for him. But sometimes when a stranger nodded at him, he would tip his cap slightly and say, "Take care now." And he would go back to his coffee, his paper, his silence. It wasn't about the headlines. It wasn't about the applause. It was about the quiet moments. The moments when people stood in silence, remembering, listening, honoring. And that Clarence Boon understood better than anyone was enough.